My name is Janice Christina Ann McCarthy, and I served at the 1st Australian Field Hospital in Vung Tau in Vietnam.
My name is Steve Kiritzis. I'm a national serviceman, and I was called up on June 1966 for 2 years service in the Australian Forces. I served in Vietnam in 1967-68 with the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment First Tour.
My name's Bill Cornford. I was a conscript. I became sort of permanent army, but I spent all of 1969 in Vietnam. Prior to that, I was at the Ordnance Training Centre in Bonegilla near Albury.
My name is Barry Orman. I served with the Australian Army in the Engineers from May 1967 until the end of February 1968.
Well, I was born on a very small island in Greece called Nisseros. That was back in 1947, and we arrived here in Melbourne in 1959. In 1963, my parents wanted to become an Australian citizens, and to get the pension, of course. And Mum said to me, "Why don't you join us? You've got nothing to lose." I said, "Mum, at this stage, there's no benefit, She says, "Come on, It's just sort of okay." At the end of the day, I went along with them. And in 1963, I did become an Australian citizen, not knowing that 3 years later, I would be called up as a national serviceman. I registered with conscription, of course, and likely or unlikely, whichever way you look at it, my numbers came up. And June 1966, I was in the Australian Forces with my first training at Puckapungo.
I know a lot of my mates were concerned that they would get called up, but that didn't seem to worry me all that much. Throughout my childhood, I'd seen pictures of people in the army. My father had been in the army prior to the Second World War and during the Second World War. My uncles, my great-grandfather, they'd been in the First World War, and I was just surrounded by, people who'd been in both First and Second World War. So it didn't sort of hit me as much as it might have done, and certainly not as bad as some of my mates who desperately didn't want to be called up.
Well, after I finished my mid, I trotted around Europe for a few months and decided it was time to come home. And I came home, and on the way home, I visited a friend in Singapore who was in the Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Service, and went up and saw her and in the mess, and I thought, oh, this isn't bad. I could do with this. Anyway, when I came home, I stayed. I went back to Box Hill for a few months because I wasn't sure whether, it was just itchy feet. But I decided after about 7 or 8 months, I decided then I would join the army. And coming from a country town where Puckapungo was very close by, I guess that was a bit of an influence.
Deep down, I think I would have been a little bit disappointed if I hadn't been called up. I think that it's perhaps taken me decades to actually admit that. I wouldn't have been broken-hearted if I hadn't been called up. But there was a sense of adventure. It was also appealed as a challenge.
I enjoyed the trip over. It was good fun. We kept stopping at all these places, and I was able to see Darwin. I'd never been to Darwin. I'd never been to Singapore. I'd never been to Penang, and because the plane was dropping stuff off on the way, we'd get in fairly early, and off we'd trot and go and have a look at the scenery. So the trip over was quite good. I enjoyed that. and but landing in Vietnam was that changed my view. The trip from the airport to the camp that we were involved in, that sort of, Vietnam was a bit of a mess. Everything was on a war footing, as you might understand, and everywhere you went there was guns and there was tanks and there were military vehicles and barricades and all that sort of stuff, and that was a bit of a culture shock. Culture shock, that's probably not the right word, but it was a bit of a, I hadn't sort of expected, I hadn't sort of mentally sort of processed that until I got there, and then I thought, this is for real.
Landing in Saigon on the 12th of December 1967, it was a bit of frightening. I mean, you could feel this country was at war. Lots of Americans about, a lot of helicopters at the airport, aeroplanes, of course, American aeroplanes. So we really felt, we are approaching to do what we're supposed to do here in South Vietnam.
Well, the airfield, there were hundreds of military aircraft. I've never seen so many aircraft in my life. Helicopters, planes, everything. But then we went out to the hospital, and we were on a beach sandy area, and I've never seen so much sand in my life, and not a bit of grass, and it was very grey, and I thought, what have I done? But anyway, got used to it.
I've never forgotten when we were at the airport in Manila, because we'd been sort of put in a corner out of the way and told to stay there until someone came to get us. And I guess we were all feeling pretty grown up and puffed up, full of ourselves. We'd sort of handled everything that the Army had thrown at us during recruit training and corps training, Canungra. I guess we had our chest puffed out a bit and a bit of a swagger, and this woman came up, and she could have been the mother of any of us, and she was quite emotional, and she said, but you all look so young. Kind of deflated us a little bit.
I was in charge of a unit that was responsible for identifying parts. It sounds silly, but for example, if you were out in the field somewhere and something broke, you would send back to get a replacement. Now, if the replacement wasn't in country, I'd get your request, and that was then my job and my team of people to find it.
So I was in the infantry battalion. I was a rifleman, and also I was in charge in our platoon of the M79 grenade launcher. Now, this M79 launcher is similar to a rifle, but more powerful, very much powerful. So I was in charge in our platoon of that.
If the battalions were out, you got gunshot wounds, you got, sadly, some amputations, particularly if you had if they were in minefields and things like that. Occasionally you got an accident, from trucks and things like that. That was just occasional, but mainly it was boys who were wounded and ill. But in the wards, when I was up there, we had an outbreak of malaria, and that was very, very busy, and the boys were very sick actually, and they were coming off the choppers, the choppers were coming in all the time. And we ended up with, we had to set up another ward, and we also we had to put them over at 36 Vac Hospital over at the airfield, the Americans, because we just ran out of beds. The trauma, in some regard, I guess I was a bit used to, but of course, they were Australian boys, and, we really worked very hard to make sure, they were going to be okay.
Engineers were responsible for building roads, the airstrip, electricity, water supply, and there was a desperate push on to get people out of living under canvas into buildings. One photo I've got is we'd poured the concrete slab for the floor of the building, and they'd already put a refrigerator and cardboard boxes on the slab, and we hadn't even started to put the building up yet. We were under constant pressure to just to get a lot of work done in a short time.
Now, the Tet Offensive was a massive operation. Of course, 3RAR and our platoon found ourselves fighting in towns such as Berea, Longdien, Wallong, and it was nothing like what we were trying to do. This was in the main streets, fighting the enemy house to house. There wasn't a jungle to fight the enemy, different to what we were trained for. But certainly, after a while, after a few days, we managed to get rid of the enemy from these towns. We lost a few soldiers, but thankfully, a lot of us returned back to our base, I think 2 or 3 weeks later.
We tried to look after ourselves, and each of the sergeants' messes used to have a pay night. I think was on a Thursday. I might be wrong, but I think it was a Thursday night. And on pay nights, not that you drew much pay anyway, we'd have a function somewhere, one of the sergeants' messes, and we used to have a prawn and beer night. I think we did. I don't know what we did, but I know one had a bingo night, and another was a karaoke type night or whatever. So you'd invite people from other units. The best one, and the one you never missed out on, was the one at the Air Force Sergeant's Mess, because they flew in Australian meat pies. They'd fly them in from Darwin with real tomato sauce.
We used to, on a Sunday actually, occasionally we would go out to the local area where the nuns were that had an orphanage, and we'd go out there and work and do a few things and mainly talk to the kids and play with the kids. And it was good for the boys, particularly because they had children at home, so they were getting a bit of away from the theatre bit and that. But we went in an ambulance with a gun jeep up in front and flak jackets on and what have you. So that was different. But it crossed my mind. I thought, I hope my mother has no idea what I'm doing.
I think one of my fondest memories is the fantastic relationship that there was between the regulars and the national servicemen. There really was no distinction at all. There was a lot of good-natured banter, which could be fairly brutal at times, but it was always good-natured, always. I think to me that was one of the highlights.
Coral Balmoral didn't finish till about the 6th of June. But around about the 2nd of June, we returned back to our base, a day or two at the base, and then we flew home. We flew back on a Qantas flight. About 11 o'clock at night, we landed at the Sindhet airport. Nobody to greet us, and I think this is where the Australian government made lots of mistakes. And I think they've learned the lessons. Now, landing at 11 o'clock at night, nobody to greet us, I think was a very low point. You are in a war zone in the morning, and you're landing in Sydney 10 hours later, 11 hours later. It wasn't good.
But the thing that got me most was arriving we arrived at Mascot Airport in Sydney, well after midnight. And I'm told the reason for arriving at that time of night was so as the public wouldn't see us. But we got off the plane and there's a whole plane of soldiers that were going on leave, and they were going on long leave, like about 6 or 8 weeks or something like that. And they had to be paid money, real cash money. This is the days before, credit cards and stuff. And there were all these soldiers running around with holding weapons, guarding the money. And it was sort of like shattering to get off the plane and thinking, oh, I'm coming back home to Australia where it's, all that war part's gone and there's all these guys holding weapons. That was a bit disconcerting.
What you found was, I went back to Ingleburn and, you'd be sort of sitting in the mess afterwards, or it didn't matter where you were, but people would be talking away and they'd be talking about little things and things that you probably talked about beforehand too, you thought, I found myself sort of getting up and going because I thought, they're making mountains out of molehills. And I guess it took me about 12 months to realise, that life was a bit different back home than it was over there.
So I would have had probably about 3 weeks leave. Most of which I spent picking pears because that was always our very busiest time of the year. And then I had to report to the Simpson Barracks at Watsonia, which I did, and he said, well, get yourself up to 21 construction at Puckapunyal. So I think I got there just about lunchtime, and in some ways I was very fortunate because that 6 months was really my transition time. I was still in the army, but I was spending a lot of time back in my previous occupation. And I've often felt for some of my counterparts who may in some cases, almost they were out on operations 1 week, a week later, they're back in Australia, they're out of the army, they've lost all of their mates for the last 2 years, and they're on their own. And I think that in some cases would have been very, very difficult.
You've probably heard the story that the public tended to blame the people that were there rather than the government for the chaos that had become Vietnam. And one thing that still sticks with me is I remember my father. He was an old soldier from the Second World War, member of the RSL, up in Morwell, and he wanted to take his son down to the RSL and introduce him, so I had to dress up in the uniform a whole bit and go to the RSL. Now, the RSL made you a member automatically if you returned from Vietnam. You didn't have to apply; they just made you a member. So I go into the RSL, and the old man's sort of showing off his boy, and most of the guys were pretty good, but one of them came up to me and he said, "So you're one of the baby killers, are you?" And I remember that this was a Second World War veteran, and he said that. I didn't go back into an RSL for 35 years after that. I became a protest marcher. It took me about 5 minutes to realise we shouldn't have been there, and after seeing what we'd really done to the Vietnamese without really helping them very much, I just felt sorry for them. I thought we shouldn't be doing this, and I joined in with everybody else.
We were told we weren't to wear our uniforms out of the unit areas where we were because there were a few problems. A few soldiers had been sort of, not assaulted, I guess, but sort of verbally abused and things. But what we felt, and we did feel very strongly about it, was that it shouldn't have been, everyone has a right to march and carry on about things if they don't agree with it, but not to abuse the troops. I mean, they were sent there by the government, and that was the way, it happened. The soldiers deserved better during that time of the moratoriums and things, and that used to upset us a bit.
I think there was an error made by the population, by the demonstrators, to pick on us. Instead, the government made a decision. It wasn't us. We were called up, we did our duty as soldiers, and I think we all should be proud of that, 100%. You know, but saying that, things have changed. I think we're looked upon as, I wouldn't say the word heroes, but we did a good job. Job well done. You know, all the Nashos that serve in Vietnam, it was a job well done.
I never experienced any hostility or antagonism at all, but I did quickly realise that people weren't that interested in my experiences. I think it was more a case of, well, he's back and he seems to be okay, you know, so let's just move along. We won't take the chance of causing, you know, upsetting him or anything. And then it was compounded by the fact as the demonstrations and that grew bigger, and that was difficult. On one level, I felt that they had the right to demonstrate. That was part of the reason that we'd been fighting, and that was the reason why Australians had fought in the First and the Second World Wars, to give people that freedom. I back then, and I still do, I would have loved to have seen from some of those people demonstrating if they'd expressed appreciation of the fact that they had the freedom to demonstrate, because I don't think there's any doubt they wouldn't have lasted their counterparts in North Vietnam if they'd attempted to demonstrate against the war. Well, they wouldn't have lasted very long at all.
Anzac to me, it is a time of remembrance. It's not about what the medals you're wearing or anything else. It's remembering those who've gone before and those that didn't come back.
I just think of the people who, for no fault of their own, lost their lives or lost some part of their being, like, you know, their mental health, or lost a limb or whatever, and they did it because they were just normal people who thought they were doing the right thing. Whether they were or not is irrelevant, because you know, they were doing something that they thought was patriotic or whatever, and they suffered the consequences of that. And for that, I feel sorry and grateful.
I had a phone call from one of my mates here in Melbourne back in 2000. He said, Steve, why don't you join us to march on Anzac Day? Now, I've never marched on Anzac Day prior to that, since 1968 when I returned home. That's 30 years later. And I did go to Anzac Day. We marched under our banner. And I have to say that was my rehabilitation, my returning back to commemorating events such as Anzac Day and marching. And I have to say I haven't missed 1 year after that. Every year we march on Anzac Day. We are proud. Yeah, we feel proud, of course. Yeah.
But Anzac Day now means a lot more to me than it did in the past. And I think part of that is because I have to appreciate the life that I've enjoyed, and along with that comes the realisation of what some of my colleagues have missed out on through no fault of their own.